Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am so glad you're here joining us today because we are embarking on a conceptual journey that fundamentally shifts how we view healthcare.
Yeah, we really are. It's a complete paradigm shift.
Right. We are stepping out of the clinic, walking away from the hospital wards entirely, and digging into the very foundations of human survival and modern medicine.
Which is where the real work happens.
Exactly. So if you are a medical student, a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or frankly, just someone fascinated by the invisible systems that keep us alive, this session is custom built for you.
Absolutely.
We're looking at Chapter 2.6 from the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health. The topic is water and sanitation.
And our mission today isn't just to review statistics or, regurgitate the textbook.
No, definitely not. Our mission is to build clear, actionable frameworks for you. We're going to trace the specific pathway from risk to exposure to outcome to intervention and finally to system impact.
Because the goal is to help you master systems thinking.
Yes. And to do that, I want you to hold on to one overarching metaphor for this entire deep dive. And that metaphor is prevention as upstream engineering.
I love that phrase, prevention as upstream engineering. It is a really powerful way to frame it.
It just makes it so tangible.
It does, because when we think of medicine, we usually picture the downstream interventions, right?
Right, the acute care.
Exactly. The acute care, the pharmaceuticals, the complex surgeries. But upstream engineering is what prevents the patient from ever needing that hospital bed in the first place.
That is the perfect way to look at it. Think of public health as this invisible, quiet revolution happening beneath our feet.
Literally beneath our feet.
Literally. Long before we ever reach for a scalpel, long before we ever prescribe a course of antibiotics or run a code in the ER, we are relying entirely on the pipes, the latrines, and the water treatment systems that engineer disease completely out of our environment.
And we often take that completely for granted.
We do. And in fact, to really set the stage for how critical this is, let's look at a massive reveal from the medical community itself. Back in 2006, the British Medical Journal polled its readers.
The BMJ poll? Yeah, this is classic.
It is so telling. They asked their readers to name the single greatest medical advance since 1840. And remember, the readers of the BMJ are doctors, surgeons, scientists.
Right. People deeply embedded in clinical medicine.
Exactly. They have the entire arsenal of modern medicine to choose from. But they did not choose antibiotics.
Nope.
They didn't choose vaccines. They didn't choose the discovery of the DNA double helix. And they didn't even choose anesthesia.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. What they chose was clean drinking water and waste disposal.
Which is a profound acknowledgement from the clinical world about where the true heavy lifting of human health actually happens.
It really is.
It acknowledges that the entire field of epidemiology literally began with an intervention in water supply. What's fascinating here is we can trace this foundational moment right back to the mid-19th century.
Specifically, 1854.
Right, 1854, with John Snow in London.
Let's actually sit with that for a moment because it is such a classic public health story, but I feel like we often rush past the mechanics of what he actually did.
We just say he took the handle off the pump and move on.
Right, exactly. But what was the context there? Why was his actions so revolutionary for the time?
Well, at the time, the prevailing medical consensus was the miasma theory.
The bad air theory.
Exactly. The idea that diseases like cholera were spread by bad air or toxic vapors rising from decaying matter. The germ theory of disease had not yet been established or widely accepted at all.
So they are fighting an invisible enemy and looking up at the sky instead of down at the water.
Precisely. And London was suffering from catastrophic cholera outbreaks. And cholera is an incredibly violent and rapid diarrheal disease. People were dying within hours of their first symptoms due to massive fluid loss.
Just horrific dehydration.
It was terrifying. And during a particularly brutal outbreak in the Soho district, John Snow, who was a physician, didn't look at the air. He looked at the geography of the deaths.
True leather epidemiology.
Yes. He meticulously mapped the location of every single cholera fatality in the neighborhood.
He was basically doing spatial epidemiology before the term even existed.
He was. And his map revealed a really striking pattern. The deaths were heavily clustered around one specific public water source.
A Broad Street pump.
The Broad Street pump. And he also noted anomalies that proved his point. For instance, workers at a nearby brewery rarely contracted cholera.
Right, I remember this. Because they were drinking the beer.
Exactly. He discovered they were given an allowance of beer to drink instead of water from the local pump. And the brewing process involves boiling the water, which killed the bacteria.
Wow.
So based on the spatial evidence, he went to the local council. He convinced them to remove the handle of the Broad Street pump. He couldn't prove what the bacteria was.
Because Vibrio cholerae wasn't fully understood yet.
Right, he didn't have the microbiology. But he understood the system. By removing the handle, he severed the pathway of transmission. The outbreak subsided.
That is upstream engineering in its absolute purest form. He isolated the human from the hazard.
He literally just engineered the exposure out of existence.
That is such a vital anchor for us. And that is why you, the listener, need to care deeply about this material. Because in your clinical practice, on the wards or in the community clinic, you're almost always seeing the end result of systemic failures.
You're seeing the downstream damage.
Always. You're treating the severe dehydration from rotavirus, you're trying to manage the chronic anemia caused by parasitic infection, or you are charting the stunted growth of a malnourished child.
And all of those clinical presentations are downstream realities that only exist because the upstream engineering broke down.
Or perhaps never existed in the first place.
Exactly.
Understanding the mechanics of water and sanitation is absolutely crucial for true, lasting disease prevention.
We have to move from reacting to the symptoms to understanding the root environmental causes.
So let's look at the sheer scale of the global burden, as laid out in the textbook, because the baseline statistics provided in the Oxford chapter are frankly staggering.
They are very sobering.
Especially when you consider we are living in an era of unprecedented technological advancement. I mean, we have rovers driving around on Mars, yet 748 million people on this planet lack access to improved water supplies.
748 million.
And the sanitation numbers are even worse. 2.5 billion people.
That's roughly 40% of the entire global population.
40%. They lack access to improved sanitation, and over 1 billion people still practice open defecation.
We really need to analyze why those numbers matter from a systems perspective, rather than just letting them wash over us as large statistics.
How do you mean?
Well, this isn't merely a simple infrastructure deficit like a town needing a new highway bridge. It is a fundamental structural driver of poverty, inequity, and catastrophic health outcomes.
Right, it touches every aspect of life.
And the burden of these missing systems is not distributed equally. It falls heavily and disproportionately on the young, on the poor, and on rural populations.
As well as those in rapidly expanding informal urban settlements, right? The slums.
Exactly. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like regionally? I know the textbook highlights specific areas where this burden is most acute.
Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa is a critical focal point in the text. In that region, improved water coverage sits at just 63%, and access to improved sanitation is at a dismal 30%.
30%. We have to visualize what that actually means for a community. If you lack safe water, your immune system is constantly battling exposure to endemic pathogens. Every single drink of water is a roll of the dice.
But it goes beyond just the microbiological risk, right? Yeah. There's the physical labor component.
Oh, absolutely. If a family has to spend 3 or 4 hours every single day walking miles to fetch water from a distant river or a muddy borehole, that is an immense amount of time and physical energy stolen away from other pursuits.
Time that could be spent on literally anything else.
It is time stolen from formal education for children and time stolen from economic productivity for adults, primarily women.
Because the burden of hauling water almost always falls on women and girls.
Almost entirely. So this infrastructure deficit literally traps entire communities in a vicious, generational cycle of disease and poverty. It is fundamentally a matter of basic environmental security.
That brings us to a really important point about clinical precision. In medicine, you wouldn't just say a patient has lung disease and leave it at that.
No, of course not.
You differentiate between asthma, COPD, pneumonia, or a pulmonary embolism, because the treatment pathway is entirely different for each.
Exactly.
The same strict logic applies to public health. We often throw around the term water-related diseases as a casual catch-all phrase, but the textbook provides a highly specific 4-part typology. Okay, let's unpack this right now. Walk us through these 4 distinct categories.
Precision here is absolutely vital because just as in clinical medicine, the public health intervention changes entirely depending on the classification of the disease.
Okay, so what is category 1?
The first category is waterborne diseases. This is the one most people are familiar with. These are diseases caused by pathogens that are physically ingested in drinking water.
So the hazard is actually inside the water you are swallowing.
Correct. The pathogen, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, or a protozoa, contaminates the water source, usually through fecal matter. You drink the water, the pathogen survives the acidic environment of your stomach, enters your intestines, and you get sick.
And cholera, which we discussed with John Snow, is the classic example of this.
Cholera is the textbook example. Enteric fevers, like typhoid fever caused by Salmonella typhi, also fall strictly into this waterborne category. The primary intervention here is improving the microbiological quality of the drinking water.
Okay, that makes sense. Quality is the issue. That's category 1, waterborne. What is the second category?
The second category is water-wash diseases, and this is a critical distinction that often gets overlooked in casual conversation.
Water washed. Okay.
These diseases are linked not to the quality of the water, but to inadequate quantities of water for personal hygiene.
Wait, let me make sure I'm grasping the distinction here. It's not about what's inside the water you are drinking. It's about the fact that you simply don't have enough physical volume of water available to wash yourself.
That is the core of it. What's fascinating here is human behavior. If water is extremely scarce, or if it takes hours to fetch a single bucket, a family will understandably prioritize that water for drinking and cooking simply to survive.
Right, you drink first, wash later.
Exactly. There is simply no water left over for washing hands, washing faces, bathing, or washing clothes. And when personal hygiene drops due to lack of volume, certain diseases flourish.
Like what? What's a clinical example?
Trachoma is a massive one. It is a severe bacterial infection of the eye, and it is a primary example of a water-wash disease. Various infectious skin diseases, like scabies or yaws, also fall into this category. You don't get them from drinking dirty water. You get them because you can't wash the pathogens off your skin or out of your eyes.
That distinction alone is a massive shift in perspective. Waterborne is about quality. Water washed is about quantity.
Exactly right.
Okay, what about the third category?
The third category is water-based diseases. And these are fascinating from an epidemiological standpoint because they are transmitted through an aquatic invertebrate host.
An invertebrate host, so like a bug or a snail in the water.
Exactly. You don't necessarily have to drink the water to get infected, and you don't catch it because your hands are dirty. You get infected simply by coming into physical contact with the water where the intermediate host lives.
So this is about exposure through the skin just by being in the environment.
Yes. Schistosomiasis is the prime example here. It's a parasitic disease. The parasite spends part of its complex life cycle developing inside specific species of freshwater snails.
And the snails are just living in the river or the lake.
Right. And then the snails release the larval form of the parasite into the water. If a human steps into that water, perhaps to bathe, to wash clothes, or to fish, the microscopic larvae physically penetrate the intact skin of the human and enter the bloodstream.
They just swim right through your skin.
They do. Guinea worm disease is another example of a water-based disease, though eradication efforts have nearly wiped it out globally.
My goodness.
Yeah, it's a huge victory. But the intervention here isn't just treating drinking water with chlorine. It's about managing the ecology of the water bodies, controlling the snail populations, and preventing human skin contact with contaminated surface water.
That is incredibly complex. You have to manage an entire ecosystem.
You really do.
And the final category.
The fourth category is water-related vector diseases. These involve insect vectors that breed in or near water, but the water itself isn't what infects you.
So the water is just the nursery for the thing that actually bites you.
Exactly the right way to think about it. The mosquitoes that transmit malaria, dengue fever, and yellow fever all require standing water to lay their eggs and for their larvae to develop.
Right.
Black flies, which transmit onchocerciasis or river blindness, breed in fast-flowing streams. Now, while the textbook chapter focuses less heavily on this fourth category, recognizing it is an essential part of the complete public health typology.
Why is that?
Because of unintended consequences. If you have poor drainage around a community water tap, you might inadvertently create a puddle that becomes a breeding ground for malaria mosquitoes.
Oh, I see.
So thereby, you are solving a waterborne disease problem, but creating a water-related vector problem.
That is brilliant. That framework, waterborne, water-washed, water-based, and water-related vector, is such a powerful diagnostic tool for understanding the systemic issue at hand.
It really categorizes the engineering challenge.
It does. Now, we need to clarify another foundational term, the word sanitation. It's one of those words that is used constantly in general conversation, but it can mean everything and nothing depending on who you ask.
It's very vague in public discourse.
Right. So how does the public health field strictly define it?
In public health engineering, we cannot rely on vague definitions. The textbook relies on a highly specific operational definition of sanitation. It is defined not as a single object like a toilet.
Okay.
It is defined as an entire managed system. It is a system where human excreta is, step 1, safely collected with dignity.
Collected. Got it.
Step 2, it is transported to a suitable location. Step 3, it is treated or contained to fully eliminate its pathogenicity. And step 4, it is finally reused or discharged safely into the environment without causing harm.
So it's an entire chain of events. And if any single link in that chain breaks, the system fails.
That is the crucial takeaway. If a city builds beautiful, modern flush toilets so the waste is collected safely.
Step 1, check.
Right. But the sewer pipes just dump raw, untreated sewage directly into the local river where people downstream wash their clothes, then true sanitation has not been achieved.
You just moved the problem.
Exactly. The hazard was just relocated, not neutralized. Every step, collection, transport, treatment, and safe disposal must function for it to be considered successful public health sanitation.
To track all of this on a global scale, the UN and the World Health Organization use the Joint Monitoring Program, or JMP, metrics. This is the gold standard for global data collection.
Yes, the JMP data is what drives policy.
Right. And they classify all water and sanitation sources as either improved or unimproved. This is where the data comes from when we say 748 million people lack improved water. But what do those labels actually mean on the ground? Let's start with water. What makes a water source improved?
An improved drinking water source is one that, by the very nature of its construction and design, is likely to protect the source from outside contamination, particularly from fecal matter.
Okay, so it's about physical protection.
Yes. This includes piped tap water directly into a dwelling or a public standpipe. It also includes boreholes, protected dug wells, protected springs, and rainwater harvesting systems.
What does protected mean in this specific context? Like, if I dig a well in a village, how do I know if it's protected?
It comes down to the physical engineering of the barrier. A protected well will have a concrete apron surrounding the opening.
A concrete apron.
Right. This prevents surface water and mud from washing back down into the shaft when it rains. It will have a proper cover and a hand pump to draw the water, rather than dropping a potentially dirty communal bucket down on a rope.
Because the rope and bucket drag dirt back into the water every time.
Precisely. A protected spring has a concrete box built around the eye of the spring where the water emerges from the ground, ensuring dirt and surface runoff can't mix with the clean groundwater.
So an unimproved source is basically one that lacks those physical barriers.
Correct. Unimproved sources include unprotected springs, unprotected dug wells, surface water like rivers, dams, or lakes, and tankered water provided by vendor trucks, which is highly prone to contamination during transport and storage.
Now, there is one item on the unimproved list that always surprises people, especially in high-income settings: bottled water.
Ah, yes. The bottled water paradox.
Why on earth does the JMP classify bottled water as an unimproved public health source?
It seems so counterintuitive because we associate bottled water with ultimate purity. But in the context of global public health metrics, especially in low-income settings, bottled water is often totally unregulated.
So you don't actually know what's in it.
Right. The source of the water inside the bottle might be highly questionable, and the plastic bottles themselves are sometimes refilled in unsanitary conditions.
But there's a bigger issue too, right, relating back to our categories.
Yes, even more importantly, classifying a source as improved isn't just about drinking. It's about having sufficient volume for hygiene.
The water-washed category.
Exactly. A family relying entirely on purchasing small bottles of water will never have enough volume to wash their hands properly, bathe, or clean their environment.
It's too expensive and too small.
Exactly. Therefore, it fails to meet the systemic criteria for an improved, sustainable public health water source.
That makes perfect sense when you view it through the lens of water-washed diseases. We need volume, not just a sealed bottle. Now, how does the JMP categorize sanitation?
For sanitation, an improved facility is one that hygienically separates human excreta from human contact. This includes a private flush toilet connected to a pipe sewer system or a proper septic tank.
And what if there are no sewers?
In areas without sewers, it includes a ventilated, improved pit latrine. This uses a specific airflow design, usually a tall pipe, to trap flies and pull odors out of the structure. Or it includes a composting toilet.
And unimproved sanitation.
Unimproved facilities include open pit latrines without slabs, bucket latrines where waste is manually collected by workers, hanging latrines that just drop waste over a body of water, and of course, open defecation in fields or waterways.
And there's a controversial one here, too.
Yes. Crucially, the JMP historically categorizes any shared public facilities as unimproved, regardless of how well they are built.
We are definitely going to dig into the complexities of shared facilities later, because that is a major debate in urban planning. But the core idea here is clear. Improved systems structurally and physically isolate the human from the hazard.
That is the foundation.
Which brings us perfectly to our next major conceptual framework. If we are talking about isolating humans from hazards, we need a mental model of exactly how that hazard travels through the environment. Listeners, I want you to picture the classic F diagram.
The F diagram. It is arguably the most famous and essential map of fecal-oral transmission in all of public health.
It really is. Walk us through it.
The F diagram is brilliant in its simplicity. It maps the specific routes that enteric pathogens take to move from the feces of an infected host into the mouth of a new susceptible host. It all starts with one primary source point.
Feces.
Okay, from that primary source, the pathogens can radiate outward along multiple pathways, and they all start with the letter F.
Let's trace those pathways. What's the first one?
The first pathway is fingers. Someone defecates, or perhaps cleans a child who is defecated and fails to wash their hands properly. The microscopic pathogens are now literally on their fingers.
And then they touch their face.
They touch their own mouth, or they prepare food, or they touch someone else, physically transmitting the disease.
Okay. And the second pathway?
Flies. Flies are mechanical vectors. They land on human excreta left in the open environment. The pathogens stick to their legs and bodies.
Just mechanically clinging to them.
Right. The fly then buzzes away and lands on a plate of food sitting on a table. The pathogens are transferred to the food.
Pathway number 3.
Fields. This represents the broader soil and agricultural environment. If feces are deposited in fields, or if untreated wastewater is used for irrigation, the soil itself becomes highly contaminated.
Yeah, and then we eat the crops.
Exactly. Crops grown in that soil, especially vegetables eaten raw, become vehicles for the pathogens. Furthermore, children playing in contaminated dirt can ingest the pathogens directly.
And the final pathway.
Fluids. This is the water pathway. Feces are washed by rain into surface water, or they leach through the ground into poorly constructed wells. The drinking water supply itself becomes the transmission vehicle.
So we have feces spreading to fingers, flies, fields, and fluids. And where do they all ultimately end up?
They all eventually converge on one final F food.
Food.
Whether it's prepared with contaminated fingers, landed on by contaminated flies, grown in contaminated fields, or washed in contaminated fluids, the food becomes the final vehicle before it is ingested by the new host.
And that completes the fecal-oral cycle.
Yes. So public health engineering, therefore, is entirely about erecting strategic physical and behavioral barriers across these specific F pathways to interrupt transmission.
Let's talk about the clinical toll of what happens when those pathways are not blocked. The heavy hitter traveling across the F diagram is diarrheal disease. We read the statistics earlier, and the mortality numbers are truly devastating.
They are heartbreaking.
We were talking about 1.5 million deaths globally every single year, and tragically, that includes 760,000 children under the age of 5.
That's essentially a preventable childhood death every few minutes.
It's staggering. Diarrhea accounts for a massive 11% of the entire under 5 disease burden in low-income countries. When you are on a pediatric ward in these settings, this is what you are fighting every single day.
It's the dominant clinical presentation.
Right. And the immediate physiological threat is rapid, severe dehydration and catastrophic electrolyte loss. The child goes into hypovolemic shock. We treat that acute crisis with oral rehydration therapy or IV fluids if they're critical.
That's the downstream clinical response.
Exactly. But the epidemiological nuance that the textbook stresses is that simply surviving the acute diarrheal episode isn't the end of the story. Repeated episodes cause profound long-term damage.
The morbidity is just as crucial to understand as the mortality. And to truly grasp the clinical mechanisms at play here, we have to look at the findings of the multi-country GMS study, which is prominently featured in the text.
GEM? What does that stand for again?
GMS stands for the Global Enteric Multicenter Study. It was a massive, rigorously controlled epidemiological undertaking that fundamentally shifted an understanding of childhood diarrhea.
What made the GMS study so revolutionary? What did it change?
Well, before GMS, we obviously knew children were getting sick, but the specific microbial culprits were often obscured. It's hard to test every single child in a rural clinic.
Right, you just treat the symptoms.
Exactly. But the GEM study utilized intense laboratory diagnostics, and it identified that out of all the dozens of possible enteric pathogens out there, just 4 specific bugs drive the vast majority of moderate to severe diarrheal cases in children across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia.
Just 4 pathogens cause the bulk of the severe illness. That is highly specific. What are they?
They are rotavirus, cryptosporidium, STE-tech, which is a specific strain of enterotoxigenic E. coli that produces a heat-stable toxin, and Shigella.
Rotavirus, crypto, STE-tech, and Shigella.
Yes. The study brought absolute clinical clarity to the burden. It found that if a child contracted moderate to severe diarrhea from these specific pathogens, their odds of dying within the next few months were 8.5 times higher than a child without the disease.
Wait, 8.5 times higher even after the acute episode.
Yes, the physiological insult is that severe. Furthermore, a staggering 88% of those deaths occurred in the first 2 years of life.
The vulnerability in those first 24 months is incredible.
It is the absolute critical window of development. When we talk about erecting barriers on the F diagram, we are not just talking abstractly about germs. We are specifically, aggressively trying to stop rotavirus, cryptosporidium, STE-tech, and Shigella from entering the mouths of infants.
That makes the mission so much more concrete. But this is where the textbook forces us to broaden our perspective. We so often equate water and sanitation solely with watery diarrhea, but the clinical picture is much wider.
It's much broader.
We have to shift our focus to parasites. The burden of worms and blinding diseases linked to poor sanitation is immense. Let's explore soil-transmitted helminths, or STHs.
The sheer scale of soil-transmitted helminths is difficult to comprehend. Over 2 billion people globally are infected.
2 billion.
Yes. The 3 primary culprits we focus on are Ascaris lumbricoides, which is the giant roundworm, Trichuris trichiura, the whipworm, and hookworm. The mechanism of transmission for these parasites ties directly, undeniably back to a lack of primary sanitation.
How exactly do they travel through the environment to infect a human?
For Ascaris and Trichuris, the cycle is a straightforward fecal oral route. An infected person excretes thousands of microscopic eggs in their feces. If they practice open defecation or use a latrine that leaks into the surrounding area, those eggs contaminate the soil.
So this is the faces to fields pathway on our diagram.
Exactly. The eggs mature in the dirt. A child playing in the dirt gets the eggs on their hands, the fingers pathway, and subsequently ingests them. The eggs hatch in the intestines, and the worms grow, sometimes to a foot long in the case of Ascaris.
A foot long inside a child's intestine. That is horrifying.
It is, and they sit there absorbing the child's nutrients.
And what about hookworm? You mentioned it was slightly different.
Hookworm is more insidious because it bypasses the mouth entirely. The eggs are excreted into the soil just like the others, but they hatch into microscopic larvae in the warm, moist dirt.
Okay, so they are alive in the dirt.
Right. If a person, often a farmer or a child, walks barefoot across that contaminated soil, the hookworm larvae physically penetrate the intact skin of their feet.
They just drill right through the skin.
Yes. From there, they enter the bloodstream, travel up to the lungs, are coughed up over the epiglottis, and swallowed down into the gastrointestinal tract.
That life cycle is just unreal.
It's a complex migration. Once in the small intestine, they use specialized mouthparts to attach to the intestinal wall and literally feed on the host's blood.
And what is the clinical outcome of having these parasites constantly feeding on your blood?
Chronically, this parasitic load leads to severe physical stunting and significant cognitive impairment in developing children. They simply cannot absorb the nutrition they need to grow.
Because the worms are stealing it all.
Exactly. And hookworm, specifically because it actively consumes blood, is a massive driver of iron deficiency anemia. This is particularly dangerous, even lethal, for pregnant women.
Because their blood volume demands are already so high.
Right. Severe anemia in pregnancy drastically increases the risk of maternal mortality, premature birth, and dangerously low birth weight for the infant. All of this cascades from the initial failure to safely isolate human feces from the soil.
It is a devastating chain of events. And then there's schistosomiasis, which you introduced earlier as our classic water-based disease. The textbook notes it affects roughly 200 million people.
100 million.
And the life cycle of this parasite feels almost like science fiction. Can you walk us through the mechanics of how it spreads?
The life cycle of schistosoma requires precise environmental conditions to succeed, which, frankly, makes it highly susceptible to upstream engineering. It starts when an infected human urinates or defecates into fresh water, a river, a lake, or an irrigation canal.
Okay.
The parasite eggs hatch in the water into a larval stage called a merocytium. This merocytium has only a few hours to find and infect a very specific type of freshwater aquatic snail.
The intermediate host.
Exactly. Inside the snail, the parasite multiplies exponentially. The snail then releases thousands of a new larval form called cercariae back into the water.
And this is where the human exposure happens.
Exactly. These cercariae swim in the water waiting for a mammalian host. If a person wades into the water to wash clothes, bathe, or plant rice, the cercariae detect the chemical signature of human skin and penetrate it within minutes.
That fast.
Very fast. The person might feel a brief prickling sensation known as swimmer's itch. The larvae migrate through the bloodstream to the liver to mature and eventually settle in the blood vessels surrounding either the intestines or the bladder, depending on the specific species.
Once they settle in those blood vessels, what is the clinical impact on the patient?
Interestingly, the adult worms themselves don't cause the primary pathology. It's their eggs.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The female worms produce hundreds of eggs a day. While many are excreted to continue the life cycle, many get trapped in the surrounding human tissues. The body mounts a massive immune response against these trapped eggs, leading to severe granulomatous inflammation.
The body is attacking the eggs.
Right. And over years, this causes profound tissue scarring and fibrosis. In the intestines, it causes organ enlargement and severe damage. But the textbook explicitly highlights a terrifying outcome regarding the species Schistosoma hematobium, which targets the bladder.
What does it do to the bladder?
The chronic, decades-long inflammation and scarring of the bladder wall is a direct causal link to the development of squamous cell carcinoma of the bladder in adulthood.
Bladder cancer.
Bladder cancer, caused by a parasite.
This perfectly illustrates the risk-to-outcome framework we are trying to build today. The baseline risk is an environment lacking safe sanitation and water infrastructure.
Right.
The exposure event is simply a person going about their daily life, making skin contact with contaminated surface water because they have no safe piped alternative. The long-term outcome is a systemic parasitic infection that causes chronic organ damage and ultimately leads to bladder cancer.
It's a straight line.
So if you want to prevent that cancer, the intervention isn't an oncology ward. It must be upstream engineering. We had to prevent the initial fecal and urinary contamination of the water bodies, and we have to provide communities with safe, alternative washing facilities so they don't have to wade into snail-infested rivers.
Exactly. You engineer the exposure out of existence.
Before we move off the burden of disease, we absolutely cannot forget trachoma. The textbook states it is responsible for 15% of all blindness worldwide.
It's a massive cause of preventable blindness.
This connects sanitation to eye disease in a way that is just fundamentally mind-blowing for a lot of people first encountering global public health.
Trachoma is a brilliant example of why understanding the specific vectors is so important. Clinically, trachoma is caused by repeated infections of the eye with the bacterium Chlamydia trachomatis.
Repeated infections.
Right. Over time, these repeated infections cause the inner eyelid to become severely scarred. The scarring causes the eyelid to turn inward, a condition called trichiasis. The patient's own eyelashes then continuously scrape against the cornea every single time they blink. Eventually, this mechanical scraping turns the clear cornea opaque and causes irreversible blindness.
But how does the bacteria get to the eye in the first place, and what is the specific link to sanitation?
The bacteria can be spread directly by contaminated fingers or shared face cloths, which ties back to our water wash category where lack of water volume prevents daily face washing.
Okay, that makes sense.
But a primary transmission vector in many highly endemic areas is the eye-seeking fly, Musca sorbens. These flies are naturally attracted to the moisture of human eyes. They feed on the ocular discharge of an infected child, pick up the bacteria, and then land on the eyes of another child, transmitting the infection.
Okay, so it's a fly problem. But why is it a sanitation problem?
Because of where that specific fly breeds. Entomological studies have proven that Musca sorbens breeds primarily and most successfully in human solid feces that are left exposed in the open environment.
Human feces.
Yes. Interestingly, they do not breed effectively in the dark, enclosed environment of a pit latrine. Therefore, A blinding eye disease is mechanistically and directly linked to the presence of open defecation.
I want to make sure I'm fully capturing the power of that connection. By building a simple drop-hole latrine with a slab and a cover, you are removing the primary breeding ground for the fly.
Right.
You eliminate the vector, and you literally prevent blindness.
That is systems thinking applied. A latrine is an intervention against blindness.
That is incredible. But there's one more physiological mechanism we need to cover in this section, and it is perhaps the most insidious. We are talking about environmental enteropathy, which is sometimes referred to in the literature as tropical enteropathy.
This is a huge topic.
For me, reading this section fundamentally altered how I view global malnutrition. We're traditionally taught that malnutrition is primarily a caloric deficit, right? A lack of available food.
Or that it occurs secondary to the acute loss of nutrients during a severe diarrheal episode.
Exactly. But the textbook reveals a hidden chronic structural pathway.
This is truly a paradigm-shifting concept in pediatric global health. Environmental enteropathy is a chronic subclinical condition.
Subclinical meaning no obvious symptoms.
Right. Subclinical means the child might not present with obvious acute watery diarrhea. They might seem generally okay day to day, but their gastrointestinal tract is being fundamentally restructured and damaged from the inside out.
How does that restructuring happen? What is the actual trigger?
The mechanism is chronic exposure. Young children, particularly toddlers, living in environments with poor sanitation and high rates of open defecation are constantly, daily ingesting massive quantities of fecal bacteria.
Just from their environment.
They get it from the dirt they play in, the water they drink, and the contaminated objects they put in their mouths. This relentless daily onslaught of pathogens causes a state of persistent low-grade inflammation in the jejunum, the middle section of the small intestine.
And what does that chronic inflammation do to the physical architecture of the gut?
Well, normally the lining of the small intestine is covered in tiny, finger-like projections called villi, which maximize the surface area for absorbing nutrients. Deep between the villi are the crypts.
Right.
In environmental enteropathy, the constant inflammation causes those delicate villi to blunt and atrophy. They flatten out. At the same time, the crypts undergo hyperplasia. They deepen and enlarge.
If I can use an analogy here, it's like taking a lush, thick shag carpet, which represents the healthy villi with tons of surface area.
Yes, perfect.
And wearing it down until it's as flat and smooth as a tile floor.
That is an excellent visual. You lose the massive surface area required for absorption. Furthermore, the mucosal barrier of the gut wall becomes compromised. It becomes leaky, allowing bacteria to translocate across the gut wall into the bloodstream.
Which triggers an immune response.
Exactly. It keeps the child's immune system in a state of constant systemic activation.
So the clinical consequence is twofold. Even if you provide that child with a perfectly balanced, calorie-dense, nutrient-rich diet, their intestines physically lack the structural architecture to absorb the nutrients.
They eat, but they starve.
They eat, but they starve. Malabsorption occurs at a physical, structural level.
And secondly, because their immune system is constantly fighting this low-grade microbial invasion, massive amounts of metabolic energy, calories that should be dedicated to building bones, muscle, and brain tissue are redirected merely to sustain the immune response.
It's an immune system tax.
Yes, and this insidious mechanism is increasingly recognized as a primary causal driver behind the estimated 165 million children globally who suffer from physical stunting.
That reframes everything. Water and sanitation are not just tools to prevent acute infections. They are fundamental, indispensable nutritional interventions.
You cannot solve global childhood stunting purely with food aid if you do not also solve the environmental enteropathy causing the malabsorption.
You have to fix the plumbing before you can fix the nutrition.
Perfectly said.
All right, we have comprehensively mapped the burden. We understand the typologies, the pathways of the F diagram, the clinical devastation of the pathogens and parasites, and the hidden structural damage of enteropathy. So how do we engineer our way out of this?
This is where we talk solutions.
Let's transition into the interventions and the evidence base supporting them. How do we map our engineering solutions directly onto the F diagram we discussed earlier?
We approach it by dividing our interventions into two categories: primary barriers and secondary barriers.
Okay, primary and secondary.
The primary barrier is safe excreta disposal, which is the strict definition of sanitation. If you safely isolate the feces at the source, right at the point of defecation, you block every single F pathway from the very beginning.
You remove the hazard from the environment entirely.
Yes. The pathogens can never reach the fingers, the flies, the fields, or the fluid.
It's the ultimate upstream choke point.
Exactly. Secondary barriers, on the other hand, are implemented further down the transmission pathways.
Give me an example of a secondary barrier.
Hand washing with soap is a secondary barrier. It blocks the finger's pathway after the hands have already been contaminated. Point-of-use water treatment, like boiling or filtering, is a secondary barrier. It blocks the fluid's pathway right before ingestion. Fly control is a secondary barrier blocking the fly's pathway.
So they are defense in depth.
While secondary barriers are crucial layers of defense, the most efficient and mathematically powerful engineering is to install the primary barrier and stop the cascade before it ever begins.
And the textbook provides the rigorous epidemiological evidence to back up that hierarchy. The systematic reviews cited in the chapter are definitive.
The numbers are very clear.
Implementing safe sanitation significantly reduces the odds of soil-transmitted helminth infections, boasting an odds ratio of roughly 0.66. Providing piped water access dramatically reduces the prevalence of Ascaris and Trichuris.
Right.
But diving into the data brings up a fascinating and crucial nuance regarding water access that we touched on during our definitions. It's the debate between water quantity versus water quality.
This is a huge debate in the field.
As a clinician, my initial instinct is always to demand microbiologically pure water. I want 0 pathogens in the water my patients drink. But public health data tells a much more behaviorally complex story, doesn't it?
It does. And this is where we look at a highly influential concept in public health engineering, the L-shaped curve of water consumption.
The L-shaped curve.
This curve demonstrates that human behavior regarding water use is not driven primarily by health knowledge, but entirely by physical access and time.
Paint a picture of that curve for us. What does it look like on the ground?
Imagine a graph where the horizontal x-axis is the round-trip time it takes to fetch water, and the vertical y-axis is the volume of water consumed per person per day.
Okay, got the graph in my head.
If a household has to make a round trip of anywhere between 5 minutes and 30 minutes to fetch water from a source, their daily consumption remains remarkably flat, forming the horizontal base of the L.
You're just flat lines.
It sits constantly at about 15 liters per person per day.
Why does it stay flat at 15 liters, regardless of whether the walk is 5 minutes or 25 minutes?
Because of the immense physical burden, water is incredibly heavy. 1 liter weighs 1 kilogram. A standard jerrycan holds 20 liters.
That's 20 kilos, 44 pounds.
Whether you walk 5 minutes or 30 minutes, carrying 20 kilograms back to your house is exhausting. So families naturally cap their effort. At 15 liters per person, you have just enough water for basic biological survival, hydration, and cooking.
But at that low volume, you are severely rationing.
You are. There is absolutely no water left over for liberal hand washing, bathing, or washing clothes.
So they are trapped in the water-watch disease zone.
Exactly. Now look at the vertical part of the L curve. The data shows that consumption only significantly increases, jumping vertically up the y-axis to between 50 and 150 liters per person per day when the water is piped directly to the home or immediately into the yard.
Once the physical labor of hauling water is removed, usage skyrockets.
Precisely, because suddenly they have the sheer volume needed to interrupt those transmission pathways.
Having enough water to wash faces daily prevents trachoma transmission. Having enough water to wash hands thoroughly with soap multiple times a day blocks the secondary fecal-oral pathways.
The textbook emphasizes a profound conclusion here. Increasing the quantity and convenience of available water is sometimes just as critical, and historically has yielded massive health dividends, even if the microbiological quality of that piped water isn't 100% perfect.
Because the behavioral shift enabled by high volume is a powerful disease interrupter.
It allows people to wash the pathogens away.
That is a brilliant insight into human behavior. But of course, we have to acknowledge the reality of global infrastructure. Even when a municipality manages to lay pipes to a neighborhood, that piped water isn't always available 24/7.
No, intermittent supply is a massive problem globally.
Systems fail, pumps break, or water is rationed and only turned on for a few hours twice a week. This forces families to collect water when it's flowing and store it in containers in the home.
Which almost inevitably leads to recontamination.
Right, from dirty hands or dipping cups. This is where the textbook shifts to household water treatment and safe storage, or HWTS.
Because centralized infrastructure takes decades and billions of dollars to build, HWTS is heavily promoted as an immediate decentralized solution.
These are interventions executed by the family at the point of use.
Right. This includes boiling water, using ceramic pot filters, employing solar water disinfection.
Sogies, right.
Yeah, SODIs, where water in clear plastic bottles is left in the sun for UV radiation to kill pathogens. Or using chlorine tablets.
These sound like highly effective localized solutions.
Yeah.
But the textbook highlights a fascinating and incredibly critical clinical caveat regarding HWTS. It is derived from complex mathematical modeling called Quantitative Microbial Risk Assessment, or QMRA.
QMRA modeling is essentially a way of mathematically simulating risk over time.
And what does this modeling reveal about the reality of household filters?
What the epidemiological models show is that the long-term health benefits of household water treatment are exceptionally fragile. They are highly sensitive to adherence.
Adherence, okay.
The modeling demonstrates that if a family uses a highly effective ceramic filter and drinks clean water 99% of the time, but they consume highly contaminated water just 1% of the time, almost all of the projected health benefits are completely wiped out.
Wait, I really want to isolate that point because it feels completely counterintuitive. 99% adherence yields almost zero long-term benefit.
I know, it sounds wrong.
If I eat healthy 99% of the time and have a donut 1% of the time, I'm still generally healthy. Why doesn't that logic apply here?
Because we are dealing with replicating biological agents, not calories. It comes down to pathogen load and infectious dose. With pathogens like rotavirus or cryptosporidium, the infectious dose is incredibly low.
Just a few microbes.
Swallowing just a few microscopic oocysts in a single sip of water can trigger a massive full-blown infection. That 1% failure, maybe the filter cracks, maybe they visit a neighbor who doesn't treat their water, or maybe they just drink directly from the tap one hot afternoon, exposes the gut to a massive pathogen load.
I see. It's exactly like prescribing a critical 10-day course of antibiotics for a severe infection. If the patient is 90% compliant and only takes it for 9 days, they might be okay. But if they only take it for 3 days, the infection comes roaring back.
And the previous days of treatment essentially didn't solve the problem.
In public health engineering, consistency is biologically essential. You cannot just occasionally protect a child's gut from environmental enteropathy or severe diarrheal pathogens.
Exactly. And this raises profound questions about public health policy. It challenges the over-reliance on point-of-use interventions.
Okay.
If we know, based on human behavioral science, that we cannot guarantee near-perfect 100% adherence to household filters or chlorination tablets day in and day out for years, then the return on investment for HWTS in terms of actual disease reduction might be severely compromised.
Because humans are human, they will make mistakes.
Right. It reinforces the ultimate need to push for reliable, centralized, 24/7 upstream infrastructure that requires zero behavioral compliance from the user. You just turn the tap and it's safe.
Speaking of return on investment, let's look at the broader systemic impact. If we are asking governments, international donors, and communities to pour billions of dollars into laying pipes, building treatment plants, and constructing latrines, what is the actual ROI? How do we justify the massive capital expenditure?
The economic justification is perhaps the strongest argument in the entire textbook. The cost-benefit data is staggering and undeniable across multiple global analyses.
Give us the numbers.
On average, global economic models show that every single dollar invested in sanitation yields a $5.50 return to the global economy.
$5.50?
And every dollar invested in water supply yields a $2 return.
A 550% return on sanitation is a financial manager's dream. But where is that money actually coming from? As a clinician, my initial instinct is always to assume that the ROI comes primarily from saved healthcare costs.
Which makes sense.
We're preventing thousands of hospital admissions for severe cholera. We are saving money on IV fluids, on antibiotics, and on the time of doctors and nurses.
Saved healthcare costs are definitely a factor in the calculation, but they are surprisingly not the primary driver.
They aren't.
No. The textbook points out that roughly 80% of the overall economic benefit of water and sanitation interventions comes from a completely different, non-clinical metric: time saved.
Time saved. That goes right back to the L-shaped curve and the 30-minute walk we discussed earlier.
This is the ultimate upstream economic impact. Think about the daily reality of millions of people. When you install a water tap in a village or build a latrine near a home, you are instantaneously freeing women and girls from spending 3 to 4 hours every single day walking to a distant contaminated river.
Or searching for a secluded place to defecate.
Exactly. You are returning millions of hours of human capital back to the community every single day.
And what does the community do with that return time?
Children, particularly young girls who often bear the burden of water collection, can actually attend school consistently. Women are free to engage in economic productivity. They can start small businesses, engage in more efficient agriculture, and invest time in the cognitive development of their infants.
The economic engine of a community is literally unlocked by the presence of a water tap and a latrine.
It's foundational to development.
We really must emphasize the profound social dynamics of this. Moving beyond just dollars and cents, the textbook highlights how deeply these infrastructure issues are intertwined with gender, security, and human rights.
Deeply intertwined.
A latrine is not just a health intervention to stop worms. It is a fundamental intervention for human dignity.
The gender disparity is stark. The lack of adequate sanitation disproportionately destroys the educational prospects of young girls.
How does a toilet affect schooling?
In many low-income settings, rural schools completely lack private, safe toilets. When girls reach puberty and begin menstruation, the lack of private washing facilities forces them to stay home to manage their hygiene.
They just can't go to school.
Missing several days of school every single month quickly leads to falling behind, which frequently translates to them dropping out entirely, prematurely ending their formal education.
Just because of a lack of a private bathroom.
And beyond education, the lack of household sanitation creates a horrifying daily security risk for women. The textbook details this with a really grim reality documented in Kenyan slums.
Yeah, the Kibera example.
The situation in high-density informal settlements like Kibera in Nairobi is a tragic illustration of this. In these slums, space is incredibly tight, and private household latrines are rare. Residents rely on shared public latrines, which are often located down dark, narrow alleyways.
And at night, that becomes incredibly dangerous.
Women face a highly elevated risk of harassment, sexual assault, and rape if they attempt to leave their homes to use these shared facilities or practice open defecation at night.
The fear is so pervasive that it fundamentally alters their behavior.
Exactly. The fear of assault is so high that women frequently resort to using what are notoriously called flying toilets.
Flying toilets.
They are forced to defecate into plastic bags inside the relative safety of their small, crowded homes during the night. And then they throw the Tide bags out into the streets, into drainage ditches, or onto the roofs of neighboring shacks the next morning.
Because it's literally safer to throw waste out the window than to walk to the bathroom.
Yes. So when we analyze the need for household sanitation, we are not just talking about enteropathy. We are deeply intertwined with physical safety, dignity, and gender equality. You cannot achieve public health without addressing human security.
That puts an incredibly stark human face on what we coldly refer to as infrastructure. It is life or death on multiple levels.
Yeah.
So from a behavioral science perspective, how do we actually solve this?
Behavioral science is the key here.
How do we get latrines built and, more importantly, consistently used? Because for decades, the standard public health approach was highly paternalistic. Governments and NGOs would just build latrines, drop them in a village, and give them away for free. But the textbook notes that approach largely failed. Why?
It failed because of a complete lack of community ownership and behavioral adaptation. If you just drop a concrete box in a village without changing the cultural mindset, people won't use it.
They just ignore it.
They might use the concrete slab to dry grain, or use the structure to store bicycles or house chickens, while continuing to practice open defecation because it is culturally ingrained or seen as more pleasant than a smelly, unfamiliar box.
That's fascinating.
This failure led to the development of two powerful, modern, behavior-driven approaches detailed in the text. The first is community-led total sanitation, or CLTS.
CLTS is a fascinating psychological approach. It originated in Bangladesh in the late 1990s, right? How does it work?
The core philosophy of CLTS is a radical departure from the past. It completely avoids providing any hardware subsidies. The program does not hand out free cement, free pipes, or free toilet pans.
No freebies.
Instead, trained facilitators enter a community and use highly participatory, visually confronting techniques to trigger a collective realization. They don't lecture about germ theory.
They don't just stand at a blackboard.
No, they have the community draw a map of the village on the ground using ash or colored powder. They ask everyone to point out exactly where they defecate. Then they conduct a walk of shame. They literally walk the entire community to the open defecation sites.
They force them to physically confront the reality of the environment they are living in.
Yes. And then they do something even more visceral. They calculate the total volume of feces the village produces in a year. They trace how water runoff during the rainy season washes that feces directly into the village water source.
Wow.
The explicit stated goal of CLTS is to intentionally trigger a community-wide sense of disgust, shame, and fear about open defecation.
It sounds incredibly intense, but it radically shifts the motivation. It's no longer about a village waiting passively for a Western donor to build them a toilet. It's about the community collectively looking at the map and deciding that they will no longer eat each other's feces.
Precisely. It leverages peer pressure, civic pride, and a collective desire for a clean environment. Once the community is triggered, they are left to their own devices.
They have to figure it out.
The community members build whatever latrines they can afford using local materials, bamboo, mud, whatever is available. The ultimate goal is for the village to declare itself officially ODF, open defecation free.
That's a huge shift in agency. But the textbook notes that CLTS does face criticism, right?
It does. Relying on shame can be problematic ethically, and sometimes the rudimentary latrines built from local materials collapse during the monsoon season, leading to a relapse into open defecation. This brings us to the second approach, sanitation marketing.
How does sanitation marketing differ from the shock tactics of CLTS?
Sanitation marketing pivots entirely from community shame to consumer desire. It treats the population not as passive beneficiaries or even as people who need to be scared into compliance, but as active consumers with preferences and purchasing power.
I love this concept. You don't just tell them what they need for their health. You do market research to figure out what they actually want for their lifestyle.
Exactly. Sanitation marketing asks, what kind of latrine design do people actually desire? Do they want a brightly colored tiled floor? Do they want a sleek porcelain pan because it signals social status, modernity, and wealth to their neighbors?
It's about aspiration.
Once you identify the aspirational design, public health programs work to design affordable modular products that meet that consumer demand. They then train and support local masons and small businesses to manufacture, market, and sell these latrines at a profit.
So you're building a local economic engine alongside public health.
Yes. It ensures long-term sustainability because you are building a local, self-sustaining market rather than relying on fickle, temporary donor subsidies.
That makes a lot of sense.
The psychological insight is that if a family saves up money and buys a latrine because they actively want the status, privacy, and convenience it brings, they feel ownership. They're vastly more likely to maintain it, clean it, and use it consistently over the long term.
Okay, as we move toward the latter part of our conceptual journey, we need to address some emerging challenges in future frameworks explicitly called out in the text. These challenges force us to question our standard definitions of success.
We always have to be questioning our metrics.
The first hidden danger is shared sanitation. We touched on this during the JMP definitions, noting that shared toilets are considered unimproved. But in hyperdense urban slums where there simply isn't physical space for every shack to have a private toilet, there is massive pressure to accept shared facilities as a valid solution. What does the epidemiological evidence say?
The data provides a very stark warning that supports the JMP's strict categorization. The textbook cites a comprehensive systematic review of 11 different studies comparing private versus shared sanitation.
And what did they find?
The review found that reliance on shared sanitation facilities actually increases the odds of a person contracting diarrhea, with an odds ratio of 1.39 compared to individuals using private household latrines.
An increased risk of nearly 40%. Why is a shared toilet so much more dangerous than a private one? Is it purely the number of users?
It comes down to the tragedy of the commons: maintenance, ownership, and cleaning behavior. When a latrine is owned by a single family, they clean it because it's in their home space.
Right.
When a facility is shared by 5, 10, or 50 households in a slum, the responsibility for cleaning becomes diffused. No single household wants to clean up after strangers.
So it just gets gross.
Consequently, these shared facilities rapidly degrade. They become heavily contaminated hubs for pathogen transmission right in the public domain. People avoid using them because they are foul, resorting back to open defecation, or they use them and pick up pathogens from the soiled surfaces.
So while shared sanitation might seem like an unavoidable logistical necessity in urban planning, the epidemiological data clearly warns us that it carries a significantly elevated disease risk.
We can't pretend it's a perfect solution.
The second hidden danger is a behavioral paradox that completely blew my mind when I read the chapter. It is the paradox of child feces disposal.
This is a massive blind spot.
You can have a public health success story, a household that saved up, engaged in sanitation marketing, and successfully built a beautiful, improved latrine. The adult members of the household use it perfectly. But the system still completely fails because of how they handle the waste of their infants and toddlers.
In many cultural settings, the feces of very young infants are mistakenly viewed as harmless. Perhaps because the child only drinks breast milk, or simply because the volume is small.
And latrines aren't really built for toddlers anyway.
Right, because latrines are often dark, have large drop holes that a child could fall into, and are located away from the main house. Mothers, understandably, do not want their toddlers using them, so nappies or potties are used. But the critical failure happens at the disposal stage.
Where's it go?
The contents of the potty or the soiled nappy itself are frequently not thrown down the latrine. Instead, they are just tossed out into the yard, thrown into the street drainage, or mixed with general household solid waste.
And why is that specific behavior so biologically disastrous?
It is disastrous because of the pathogen load. The paradox is that infant and toddler feces are actually the most dangerous biological material in the entire community.
Really, more than adult feces.
Absolutely. Young children have the highest incidence rates of enteric infections. They are the primary hosts for rotavirus and severe bacterial infections. Therefore, their feces contain astronomically higher pathogen concentrations than adult feces.
Wow.
Furthermore, think about the behavior of a toddler. They spend their day crawling on the ground. They engage in geophagia, the natural tendency to eat dirt and put objects in their mouths.
So if a household has an improved latrine, but throws the baby's nappy into the yard where the baby plays,
They are essentially still practicing open defecation, and they are doing it with the most highly infectious, lethal material right in the exact physical zone where the most vulnerable members of the family spend their time.
it completely bypasses the primary barrier they built.
It does. This teaches us that interventions cannot just focus on building the physical toilet. Behavioral campaigns must explicitly target and measure safe child feces disposal, or the entire upstream engineering effort is compromised.
Let's shift our gaze to the future. How is our overarching framework for monitoring water safety evolving? For decades, the standard public health protocol was simple. Take a sample of water from the tap, put it in a petri dish, and see if E. coli grows. If the test comes back clear, we declare the water safe. What is wrong with that approach?
The fatal flaw in that approach is that it is entirely reactive. It is end product testing. By the time your laboratory test confirms the presence of E. coli in the tap water, the community has already been drinking it for days.
The damage is done.
The exposure has already happened, and the outbreak is likely already underway. It is too late for prevention. The textbook highlights a major paradigm shift driven by the World Health Organization, the global implementation of water safety plans, or WSPs.
And how do water safety plans differ from just testing the tap?
WSPs utilize the modeling we discussed earlier, quantitative microbial risk assessment, or QMRA. But the structural framework of a WSP is actually borrowed directly from the food manufacturing industry, specifically a system called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP.
I recognize HACCP. That's the system originally developed by NASA back in the 1960s to ensure that the food sent up with astronauts into space was absolutely pathogen-free, because food poisoning in zero gravity would be catastrophic.
Exactly. And the genius of the NASA HACCP system is that you don't ensure safety by just testing the final cooked hamburger right before you eat it. You ensure safety by meticulously mapping every single step of the production process, from the slaughterhouse to the freezer temperature to the cooking temperature.
You find the weak links.
You identify every critical control point where contamination could occur, and you constantly monitor those specific parameters.
So how does that apply to a city's water supply?
A water safety plan maps the entire hydraulic system. It starts at the catchment area. Is agricultural runoff entering the reservoir? It moves to the treatment plant. Are the chlorination dosing pumps functioning perfectly every minute?
Right.
It traces through the underground distribution pipes. Are there cracks where sewage could seep in during pressure drops? You monitor these critical control points continuously. If the chlorine level drops at the plant, alarms go off and you fix it before the water ever reaches the tap.
It is the ultimate proactive upstream engineering management.
Yes.
And the textbook mentions that the targets for these systems are not just measured in zero E. coli, but in something called dailies. What is a dailies and why is it used here?
DAILY stands for Disability Adjusted Life Year. It is a metric that combines the years of life lost due to premature mortality with the years of healthy life lost due to living with a disability or disease.
It's a composite score.
It gives us a single number to quantify the total burden of a disease. By setting health-based targets measured in dailies, engineers and public health officials can say, our water system must be engineered so rigorously that the residual risk of infection causes no more than 1 microdaily of disease burden per person per year.
That is so specific.
It connects the physical engineering parameters directly to human health outcomes, incorporating the chronic impacts like enteropathy and stunting, not just acute deaths.
That is a phenomenal evolution in systems thinking. Finally, we need to touch on the environmental limits of our systems. What happens when we look at the broader ecological picture? What happens when cities run out of fresh water to simply flush our waste away, or when chemical fertilizers become too expensive for poor subsistence farmers?
This brings us to the concept of ecological sanitation, or ecosan, which is gaining crucial importance as climate change exacerbates water scarcity.
What is ecosan?
Ecosan demands that we fundamentally reconceptualize human waste. For a century, modern sanitation has treated feces and urine purely as a deadly hazard that must be diluted with massive amounts of clean drinking water and flushed away, often polluting downstream ecosystems.
Right, flush and forget.
Ecosan argues that human excreta is actually a misplaced agricultural asset.
How do you safely turn a biological hazard into an asset?
By understanding the biology of pathogen destruction, eco-sand systems, often using specially designed composting toilets, separate urine, which is mostly sterile and rich in nitrogen, from feces. The feces are kept strictly dry, no water is used for flushing.
Okay, dry waste.
Additives like ash or lime are deposited after use, which drastically raises the pH level and desiccates the waste. The sealed vault is then left to dry, usually for 12 to 18 months.
And that extended time and high pH is enough to neutralize the pathogens?
Yes. That harsh, dry, highly alkaline environment successfully kills even the hardiest pathogens, including the incredibly resilient Ascaris eggs we discussed earlier. The resulting product after a year is a safe, odorless, highly potent organic fertilizer. This approach closes the ecological loop. It completely removes the pathogens from the water cycle, saving millions of gallons of flush water, while simultaneously providing poor farmers with vital fertilizer to improve food security and local incomes.
It is an elegant, sustainable solution.
It really is.
Which perfectly illustrates the ultimate concluding takeaway from this entire chapter, the systems approach. We cannot look at any of these pieces in isolation.
Absolutely not. If we connect this all back to the bigger picture, we can no longer view water supply, latrines, hygiene behavior, and ecology as isolated individual pathways. We have to understand profound community interdependence.
How so?
A latrine doesn't just protect the specific family that uses it, it removes a vector breeding ground for blinding flies, it stops hookworm larvae from seeding the communal pathways, and it prevents feces from washing into the neighbor's drinking well during a storm.
It creates herd protection.
That is the exact clinical parallel. Just as a vaccine program relies on a critical mass of the population being immunized to protect the vulnerable newborns who cannot be vaccinated, public health engineering relies on total community coverage.
You need everyone on board.
You need widespread collective adherence to actually break the relentless cycle of enteropathy, stunting, and disease.
So as we wrap up this conceptual deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a provocative thought. Tomorrow, when you walk down the street in your city or town, I want you to actively step outside of your normal routine and really look at a simple water tap, a fire hydrant, or a storm drain set into the curb.
Really look at them.
Consider the fact that the greatest medical advancement in human history is not housed in a sterile, multi-million-dollar operating theater. It doesn't come in a pill bottle or an IV bag. It is buried in the dirt beneath your feet. Public health works its most profound miracles invisibly. Very few people ever notice the pipes beneath the city until the day they fail.
And to ensure that the vital frameworks we've unpacked today remain visible and anchored in your memory, let's move to our rapid-fire single best answer recall prompts. Listen closely, pause the audio if you need time to think, and test your retention of the material.
Here we go.
Prompt 1. Which specific water-related disease category describes infections linked not to the microbiological quality of drinking water, but to inadequate quantities of water for personal hygiene, resulting in conditions such as trachoma?
Take a second.
Answer. Water-washed diseases. Revisit the terminology section for the 4-part typology. Prompt 2. According to the F diagram mapping fecal-oral transmission, what constitutes the primary barrier, the most effective upstream intervention to interrupting disease transmission?
Think about the choke point.
Answer: safe excreta disposal or sanitation. Revisit barriers to transmission of fecal-oral diseases. Prompt 3. Which chronic, subclinical condition driven by the relentless daily ingestion of fecal bacteria is increasingly recognized as a primary causal pathway connecting poor sanitation to childhood malabsorption, stunting, and malnutrition?
The shag carpet analogy.
Answer: environmental enteropathy, also known as tropical enteropathy. Revisit the enteropathy section to review the mechanism of villus atrophy. Prompt 4. In global economic analyses of water and sanitation interventions, what specific factor contributes most significantly, constituting up to 80% to the overall massive economic benefits and return on investment?
Where's the ROI coming from?
Answer: time savings associated with better access, primarily freeing women and children from water hauling. Revisit cost effectiveness and cost benefit analyses. Prompt 5. What is the core methodological motivation behind the community-led total sanitation, or CLTS, programmatic approach to ending open defecation?
Think about the mapping exercise.
Answer: igniting a community-wide sense of disgust and shame to trigger collective behavioral change and local latrine construction, intentionally avoiding the use of hardware subsidies. Revisit community-led total sanitation. Prompt 6. Based on quantitative microbial risk assessment, or QMRA, epidemiological models, what specific behavior almost entirely negates the projected health benefits of using household water treatment and safe storage systems?
The 99% rule.
Answer: inconsistent use or even occasional consumption of untreated water, like a 1% failure rate, due to the massive infective dose exposure. Revisit need for consistency, adherence, and safe water consumption.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep engineering those upstream solutions, keep mastering systems thinking, and we will see you next time. Here are the details of this episode.
Water and sanitation. Byline: clean water. Longer lives the quiet revolution beneath our feet. Episode description: few interventions in human history have saved as many lives as clean water and adequate sanitation. Long before antibiotics and advanced surgery, improvements in water supply and sewage systems dramatically reduced mortality from infectious diseases. In this chapter, we explore water and sanitation as foundational pillars of public health. Safe drinking water prevents diarrheal diseases, cholera, typhoid, and parasitic infections. Sanitation infrastructure interrupts transmission pathways and protects entire communities. We examine the global burden of inadequate water and sanitation still disproportionately affecting low-income regions, informal settlements, and rural populations. The chapter highlights technological, behavioral, and governance solutions, from piped water systems and wastewater treatment to household-level interventions. Climate change, urbanization, and water scarcity introduce new challenges. Contamination risks, infrastructure maintenance, and inequitable access remain pressing concerns. Water and sanitation represent both engineering achievements and moral commitments. They require long-term investment, cross-sector coordination, and political will. Public health often works invisibly. Few notice the pipes beneath the city until they fail. Key takeaways: clean water and sanitation dramatically reduce infectious disease burden. Diarrheal disease remains a leading cause of child mortality globally. Infrastructure investment produces population-wide benefits. Behavioral practices influence transmission risk. Rapid urbanization strains water systems. Climate change affects water security and quality. Governance and maintenance are critical for sustainability. Equity and access remains a global challenge.